The colonists of Saren had no idea what was coming. A world once brimming with the promise of peace and prosperity, Saren now sat on the precipice of annihilation. A glowing red light stained the sky as Gorthian warships descended through the atmosphere, their engines roaring like distant thunder. They came without warning, their assault swift and brutal, taking no prisoners. It wasn't just the planet's resources they sought. It was the people, the innocent beings who had dared to live in peace under the watch of Earth's protection. Captain Cal Rivers, leader of the Crimson Shield, stood on the command deck of the Phoenix, Earth's most advanced warship. His eyes locked onto the holographic map before him, displaying the Saren system in all its ominous detail. The planet, once a symbol of humanity's hope, was now a battleground, its once vibrant cities reduced to ashes beneath the iron fist of the Gorthian Empire. "Prepare for descent," Kale ordered, his voice a calm command that belied the chaos unfolding. His team was ready. They had trained for this: covert operations, high-risk infiltration, and precise strikes. No one on Earth's side had ever faced a threat quite like the Gorthians, but the Crimson Shield had proven time and time again that they were humanity's last line of defense. The Phoenix was the jewel of Earth's fleet, a stealth warship capable of slipping through the most guarded defenses unnoticed. As they entered Saren's atmosphere, Cal's mind raced, trying to anticipate the enemy's next move. His team had trained for every eventuality, but even they could not predict the cunning and cruelty of the Gorthians. In a flash, the ship's sleek form merged with the night sky, unnoticed by the invaders below. Inside the ship's command center, the team was already preparing. Lieutenant Zora Kai, the ship's intelligence officer, worked quickly at her console, her fingers dancing across the interface, scanning for vital data about the enemy forces. Her mind was sharp. If anyone could predict the Gorthian Empire's moves, it was her. She knew every nuance of their tactics and technology, which was why she'd been chosen to lead the mission's intel operation. "We have confirmation of the enemy's deployment," Zora reported, her voice steady. "At least 3 battalions are stationed in key locations around the planet's capital. They've deployed a mind control signal that's already spreading through the planet's main city. If we don't act fast, the entire population will be enslaved." "How much time do we have?" Kale asked, his focus narrowing. 24 hours, at best," Zora replied, grimly. "Then we move out immediately," Kale said, standing from his command chair. His eyes swept over the team, and each one nodded in silent acknowledgement. The mission ahead would not be easy, but the Crimson Shield had never faltered, and they would not start now. The team members filed out of the command center, preparing their gear for the descent to Saren's surface. Sergeant Rook, the team's heavy weapons specialist, checked his combat armor and loaded his massive energy rifle, his face set in determination. Laya Oren, the tech expert and hacker, adjusted her gauntlet, ready to disable Gorthian security systems. And Alira, the mysterious resistance leader from Saren, who had joined the mission, stood silently at the back of the room, her mind clearly elsewhere. There was more to her than she had let on. Kale knew it, but there was no time to ask questions. Not yet. "Let's bring this world back from the edge," Kale said, his voice ringing with resolve. "We don't just fight for Saren today. We fight for every innocent person across the galaxy who needs us." With a unified roar of agreement, the Crimson Shield embarked on their descent. Their mission was clear: save Saren, protect its people, and send a message to the galaxy that Earth would stand as the defender of the innocent, no matter the cost. The Phoenix dropped through Saren's atmosphere like a shadow, blending seamlessly into the night sky. Below, the world's surface was marked by the scars of war, the burning remains of buildings, the smoldering wreckage of ships, and the fear that gripped the hearts of the colonists. The Gorthian forces were everywhere, their massive war machines patrolling the streets, keeping watch over the frightened civilians who had been corralled into a tight, guarded zone at the capital. Cal Rivers gazed at the destruction through the cockpit's viewport, his jaw clenched. This was no longer just about tactical strikes or covert sabotage. This was about saving a world on the brink of losing its soul. Every second counted. Approaching landing zone, Captain, Zora said, her voice coming through the comms, tight with the weight of their impending mission. We've pinpointed a resistance base in the city outskirts. That's where we'll make our first strike. Understood, Kel replied. We're going to hit them fast. This planet's survival depends on it. Rook, Orin, you're with me. Elira, keep an eye on the locals and gather intel. We can't afford any surprises. The Phoenix touched down lightly on the rocky terrain just beyond the city's periphery, and the doors opened with a hiss. The team quickly exited, their boots hitting the earth with purpose. They were in enemy territory now, and the silence of the world around them was unsettling. It felt wrong. It felt like something was waiting. As they moved toward the resistance base, Cal's eyes scanned the area for any signs of danger. There were no sounds of gunfire or combat, only the eerie stillness of a world that had been suffocated. The resistance base, a once hidden stronghold of Saren's defiant citizens, was barely visible in the shadows, tucked away behind the ruined remains of a long-abandoned factory. Their approach was swift and quiet, but Kale felt the weight of every step. The Gorthians were always watching, always listening. Inside the base, they were greeted by a small but determined group of resistance fighters, their faces grim and weary. They had been fighting for months, barely able to hold their ground against the overwhelming Gorthian forces. Elira exchanged a few quiet words with their leader, a burly man named Thorn, before turning back to Kale. She was clearly uneasy, her eyes darting around the room. Something's wrong, Elira whispered, her voice low but urgent. The Gorthians, they're not just invading. They're changing the people. You saw it when we landed, didn't you? The civilians, they're not themselves. Kale frowned. He'd noticed it too. The colonists looked like husks of their former selves, moving in eerie unison under the watchful gaze of the Gorthian soldiers. But it wasn't just the mindless drones they'd seen in some of the other colonies. It was something worse. Tell me more, Kale demanded, his voice sharp. Elira looked over her shoulder to ensure no one was listening. The Gorthians are using a bioweapon. They've infected the civilians with something. A virus, some kind of parasite. It's not just enslaving them, it's transforming them. They're becoming something different, something they can control. I think it's tied to the artifact. The Kronos Shard, Kale muttered under his breath. He had suspected this. The artifact was no mere relic. It was a weapon, and if it was tied to something as insidious as this, they needed to act quickly. We can't let this continue, Rook said, his voice thick with resolve as he slammed his rifle into position. We need to hit them now, before they can spread whatever this is to the rest of the planet. We'll stop them, Kale said, clenching his fists. We'll find the source of this infection and destroy it. No one else gets hurt. With new urgency, the Crimson Shield set out to locate the epicenter of the Gorthian operation. As they moved deeper into the city, the signs of the infection became undeniable. People whose eyes were glazed over, whose movements were stiff and mechanical. They passed through alleyways lined with makeshift barricades, their sensors picking up faint, erratic signals. The resistance had managed to hold some ground, but the Gorthians' power was growing stronger by the hour. Cal's heart tightened as they approached a large building that had once been a thriving market district. Now it was a fortress, heavily guarded by armed Gorthian soldiers. But it wasn't just the soldiers that concerned him. It was the low hum of energy fields around the building's perimeter, an energy field that radiated with a strange, unnatural energy. Everyone, stay alert, Kale commanded. This is it. As they closed in on the building, the air grew thick with tension. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Kale saw movement. A figure darted from behind a nearby wall, but it wasn't one of the Gorthians. It was a civilian, eyes wild with fear, her body twitching as if under some unseen control. Her mouth moved. but no words came out. Cal's gut twisted. The Gorthians weren't just attacking Saren. They were twisting the very people they had come to protect. The battle ahead would be like no other. Not only would they have to fight the Gorthians, but they would also have to save those who had already fallen prey to the Gorthian plague. The stakes had just risen higher than ever. The team moved swiftly through the ruins of Saren's capital, the air thick with the smell of burnt earth and the weight of impending doom. Every corner held the potential for an ambush, every shadow a hiding place for Gorthian soldiers or infected civilians. The eerie silence was broken only by the distant crackle of energy weapons and the occasional guttural roar of a Gorthian patrol. Cal kept his senses sharp, aware that any misstep could lead them into a deadly trap. Elira led the way, her movements fluid and deliberate. She knew this city better than anyone, having lived here before the Gorthians arrived. Her eyes, however, were haunted. There was something she wasn't telling them. Something that Cal could feel but couldn't quite name. Up ahead, Elira whispered, signaling the team to halt. That's where the Gorthians have set up their command center. We'll need to get inside and disable their systems before we can go after the source of the infection. Cal nodded. Rook, Orin, secure the perimeter. Zora, I need you to hack into their surveillance system. If we're going to take them down without casualties, we need eyes on the entire operation. Zora nodded and moved to the side, pulling out her compact data pad and attaching it to a nearby comm relay. As her fingers danced across the interface, Cal felt a familiar unease settle in his gut. There was something off about the way Elira had spoken. Too cautious, too evasive. He wasn't sure if it was the tension of the mission or something more, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the back of his mind. The minutes dragged on, each second passing like an eternity as Zora worked her magic. The air crackled with the hum of her hacking equipment, and Cal could hear the faint sounds of the Gorthian patrols moving ever closer. It was only a matter of time before they would be discovered. I've got it, Zora said, her voice sharp with triumph. I've broken into their systems. We got full access to their surveillance feeds. There's a guard patrol on the west entrance, but they're distracted. We can move in undetected for now. Good, Cal replied. We move fast. No mistakes. The team entered the building with practiced precision, their footsteps muffled by the crumbling walls of the city. As they passed through the darkened halls, they could hear the faint whirring of machines and the buzz of alien technology. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the place felt. This wasn't just a military base. It was something more sinister. At the heart of the building, they found what they were looking for, a large chamber, bathed in the eerie glow of the Cronus shard. It sat on an altar of black stone, its pulsing light casting long, strange shadows across the room. The artifact hummed with an unnatural energy, sending ripples through the air. The Gorthians were using it as the focal point of their operation. Its power was controlling the infected civilians, twisting their minds and bodies into something grotesque. This is it, Elira whispered, her voice barely audible. Her gaze was fixed on the artifact, and Cal could see the tension in her posture. There was something about her expression, something almost reverent. It sent a chill down his spine. What is it, Elira? Cal asked, his tone sharp. Elira's eyes flicked to him, her gaze briefly betraying a flicker of hesitation. The artifact. It's not just a weapon. It's a key, an ancient device that predates even the Gorthian Empire. They didn't discover it by accident. They're using it to control the infected, to twist them into an army. But there's more to it than that. Cal took a step closer, his eyes never leaving her. More. Elira nodded, her voice trembling ever so slightly. The Cronus shard can manipulate time. It has the power to change the course of history, to erase entire events from existence. The Gorthians think they can control it, but they're wrong. No one can control the shard, not without terrible consequences. The realization hit Cal like a punch to the gut. The Gorthians had been using the artifact as a weapon, not just against Saren, but against the entire galaxy. They could rewrite history itself, eliminate entire worlds or civilizations, as if they had never existed. "This is bigger than we thought," Kale muttered. "We need to stop them before they use it to wipe out all resistance." Elira's face darkened. "If they activate it fully, they'll change everything. Not just for Saren, but for the entire galaxy. Time will be rewritten, and no one will remember the fight we put up. We could all disappear, as if we never existed." Zora's voice cut through the tension, her words sharp. "We don't have time for a history lesson. The Gorthians are on their way. We need to make our move." Kale took a deep breath, forcing his mind back to the present. There was no more room for hesitation. The clock was ticking, and the fate of not just Saren, but every living being across the stars hung in the balance. "We destroy the shard," Kale said, his voice low but resolute. "Whatever it takes. We'll stop them here and now." With a swift motion, the team moved into position, but just as they prepared to strike, the ground beneath them trembled, and the air filled with the unmistakable sound of Gorthian boots marching toward them. The real battle was about to begin. The rumble of Gorthian soldiers' boots grew louder, echoing through the chamber like the advance of an inevitable storm. Kel's breath caught in his throat. There was no time to waste. The team had to act now, or everything they fought for would be lost. The artifact, the Kronos shard, pulsed with an eerie glow, casting its twisted light across the room as though it were alive, feeding off the darkness around it. Kel's mind raced, weighing their options. "Elira, is there any other way to disable the shard?" Kale asked urgently. Her eyes darted over to the device, her lips pressed tightly together. "We can try to disrupt its energy flow, but it's dangerous. If we make a mistake, it could trigger a catastrophic reaction. There's a reason the Gorthians have been so careful with it. It's a time-altering weapon, but it's volatile. I think they've been using it to influence their own history as much as ours." Kale nodded grimly. "We don't have the luxury of being careful. We'll disable it the hard way. Rook, cover our backs. Zora, Leah, prepare to overload their power grid. We need to buy ourselves some time." As the team set into motion, Rook moved toward the entrance, positioning himself behind a pillar to cover the team's movements. His massive energy rifle gleamed in the dim light, and his eyes narrowed with a mix of focus and determination. The slightest mistake here would mean their end. Elira took the lead, moving toward the Kronos shard with a practiced precision. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, but Kel could still see the tremor in her hands. This was personal for her, he could tell. There was something deeper at play here, but now was not the time for questions. The stakes were too high. Kel's pulse quickened as the Gorthians drew closer. They were right outside the room. If the team didn't act now, their mission would be compromised before it even started. The cold, metallic sound of their alien weapons could be heard in the corridor, and Kel's eyes flicked to the door, where he saw shadows moving just beyond the threshold. "Go. Now," Kale barked. Zora, with her expertise in tech and hacking, was the first to sprint toward the energy conduits running along the walls. Her fingers flew over her device, pulling up a series of schematics that appeared on the small screen in front of her. She worked quickly, her focus absolute. "We've got a direct connection," Zora murmured under her breath. "I'm going to loop the power grid through the system and overload their defenses. Hold tight." As she activated the sequence, a burst of energy surged through the room, and the air seemed to hum with power. The Gorthians outside immediately took notice. Their footsteps quickened, and the heavy clang of boots signaled their approach. The team was almost out of time. "Elira, we need to move now," Kale shouted. But Elira, still focused on the shard, seemed almost mesmerized by its glow. Her face was a mask of concentration, but there was a shadow behind her eyes, an emotion Cal couldn't place. "I can't leave it like this," Elira said quietly. "I need to understand how it works. There's a reason they're using it in the first place. If we destroy it now, they'll just rebuild it somewhere else. We need to learn its secrets." Kale hesitated, but the sound of the Gorthian soldiers getting closer left no room for debate. He had to make a choice, and fast. "Fine. Laya, Illyra, you stay with the shard. Zora, Rook, you and I will hold them off. We'll buy you time," Kale ordered, his voice firm. Zora immediately moved to the side with Rook, preparing for a firefight. Kale gripped his pulse rifle tightly, his mind locked into soldier mode. They couldn't let the enemy get their hands on the shard. If they did, it would change everything. The doors to the room slammed open, and the first wave of Gorthian soldiers poured in, clad in their heavy, segmented armor, their weapons raised and ready. Kale fired first, the crack of his pulse rifle reverberating through the chamber. The blast hit a Gorthian soldier square in the chest, sending him crashing to the floor. But there were more, dozens more, flooding into the room. Rook fired a shot from his heavy gun, knocking another soldier off his feet, but the enemy forces kept coming. The Gorthians moved with brutal precision, their dark eyes fixed on the intruders. Their alien weaponry crackled with energy as they returned fire, the room lighting up with a blinding flurry of blasts. "Illyra, Leah, now," Kale shouted, ducking behind cover as another blast exploded just inches from his position. Leah rushed to Illyra's side, her fingers working quickly as she typed into a nearby console to amplify the interference. Illyra's eyes were still locked on the shard, her expression unreadable as she struggled to activate something within its core. A low hum filled the room as the device seemed to react to her touch, pulsing in response. Kale could see the strain on her face, but there was no time to stop and question it. They were in the fight of their lives. "Kale," Zora's voice rang out, urgency in her tone. "We're almost there, but we need more time. Keep them off us for just a few more seconds." Kale's heart pounded as he took aim again, firing with precision to take down more of the advancing soldiers. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on him. The fate of the entire galaxy depended on what they did next. The countdown had begun. The room was a battlefield. Kale's pulse rifle barked with each shot, the rounds tearing through the advancing Gorthian soldiers like a storm of fire. He ducked behind a wall of debris as the Gorthians retaliated, their weapons crackling with devastating energy. Blasts ricocheted off the walls, some just inches from his face. The air smelled of burning ozone and metal, thick with the metallic tang of ionized air. But through the chaos, Kale could see the mission ahead of them. He had to hold the line long enough for Illyra and Laya to finish what they'd started. "Zora, how much longer?" Kale shouted, his voice strained as he fired again. Zora's voice crackled over the comms, her tone tight with focus. "We're almost there. Just a few more seconds to override their defense grid and disable the reinforcements. Do what you can. Rook, keep them suppressed." Kale barked, shifting his position to get a better angle. His eyes locked onto a Gorthian officer leading the new wave of troops, his armor glinting in the dim light. Kale adjusted his aim, fired, then cursed as the officer ducked behind cover. Rook didn't need the order. He was already moving. He fired his heavy weapon with brutal precision, sending large caliber rounds into the Gorthian officer's position, pushing them back for the moment. The Phoenix team was outnumbered, but they had trained for this. They were veterans, and they wouldn't give up. Meanwhile, Illyra stood at the center of the chaos, her fingers dancing across the ancient console built into the floor, trying to access the Chronos Shard's core. Sweat beaded on her brow as she worked furiously, her eyes scanning the data as the machine seemed to pulse in response to her touch. The hum of the shard grew louder, its unnatural glow intensifying. "I can feel it," Illyra whispered, almost to herself. "It's responding to my energy signature, but I need more time." Leah moved beside her, checking the status of the interferences they'd set up to disrupt the Gorthian power grid. "Hurry, Illyra. We don't have much longer before the rest of their fleet arrives." Kale clenched his teeth. The seconds seemed to stretch out forever. The Gorthian forces were relentless. It wouldn't be long before they brought in reinforcements, their overwhelming numbers turning the tide of battle. Every shot he fired, every step they took, was one closer to their final stand. "Kale," Zora's voice rang out again. "I've got control of the Gorthian sentries network. The reinforcements will be delayed by at least 10 minutes. Kale's heart skipped a beat. 10 minutes. That was more than they'd hoped for. "Good work, Zora. Hold tight. We're pushing them back." His team's resolve hardened with the new window of opportunity. The constant barrage of fire continued to fill the air, but Kale saw a change in the way the Gorthians moved. The delay in reinforcements gave them just enough breathing room to focus their efforts on ending this fight. Kale gestured for Rook to follow him as he sprinted to the left flank, his rifle in hand. The Gorthians were trying to regroup, reorganizing in smaller units. Kale and Rook moved with precision, each step taken with calculated efficiency. They were beginning to turn the tide. The next few minutes were a whirlwind of action. Kale moved from cover to cover, leading the charge, his mind a blur of tactical decisions. He could feel his muscles aching, the weight of his armor bearing down on him. But he ignored it. The mission came first. As Cal's team mowed through the Gorthian lines, he noticed that the soldiers seemed to grow more erratic, their movements more desperate. They were running out of options. "Rook, focus on the energy reactors," Kale ordered, pointing toward a large, glowing structure in the back of the room. "We disable that. We cut off their power supply." Without hesitation, Rook aimed and fired, the shockwaves of each blast shaking the room. The Gorthian energy reactor hissed and cracked, sparks flying as the structure trembled under the assault. But just as Kale thought they were gaining ground, a new presence entered the fray. Dread surged through his chest. The door to the chamber slammed open with a deafening clang, and a towering figure stepped into the room. A Gorthian general. The elite warrior, a behemoth in dark, ceremonial armor, wielded a massive energy blade that crackled with lethal energy. His eyes, glowing an unsettling yellow, locked onto Kale with predatory precision. "Captain Rivers," the general's voice boomed, his words thick with disdain. "You will not interfere with our plans. The Kronos shard will be mine, and your rebellion will fall." Cal's blood ran cold. This was no ordinary soldier. This was the heart of the Gorthian Empire's invasion. "Get out of my way," Kale growled, leveling his rifle. The general laughed, the sound like the grinding of metal. "I will crush you, human. You cannot fight destiny." Cal's mind raced as he sized up the towering figure. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He had no choice but to face the Gorthian general head-on. The fate of Seren, of the galaxy, depended on this final confrontation. With a roar, the Gorthian general lunged forward, his blade crackling with destructive energy. Kale barely had time to raise his weapon before the massive blade slashed through the air, coming down with the force of 1,000 storms. And in that moment, Kale realized the real battle was only just beginning. Cal's heart pounded in his chest as the Gorthian general's blade descended like a meteor. The air around it warped, shimmering with energy as the massive weapon sliced through the space Cal had just occupied. He dove to the side, rolling across the floor as the ground splintered beneath the immense power of the blow. Dust and debris filled the air, momentarily blinding him. His hand gripped the pulse rifle tightly, but he knew that it was no match for the general's massive energy blade. He couldn't afford to be caught in the open again. Adrenaline surged through his veins as Cal scrambled to his feet, his mind calculating his next move. "Elira," he shouted over his comms, "is the shard almost destabilized?" "I'm close." Elira's voice crackled back. "But I need more time. The shard's core is reacting violently to our interference. I can't guarantee it won't explode if I push further." Cal's chest tightened. They didn't have much time. Every second that ticked by felt like a countdown to their demise. The general wasn't waiting. He advanced with terrifying speed, his armored footfalls resounding like a drumbeat of war. Kale barely had time to duck behind a column as the general swung his energy blade again, carving through the air with a crackling roar. He peered around the corner, taking a breath, steeling himself for what he had to do next. The general's armor was formidable, almost impenetrable, but Kale had faced worse odds. He had to find a weakness, a crack in the armor, a gap in the assault. "Rook, can you give me a shot?" Kale shouted, positioning himself for an attack. "On it," came Rook's reply. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed as Rook moved into position. Kale's gaze flicked to the hulking figure of the Gorthian general, who was pacing toward him with menacing intent. The general sneered, clearly enjoying the chase. "You fight like all the rest of your kind. Brave, but foolish. You will fall before the might of the Empire." Kale knew he had only one shot at this. He rose from behind the pillar and took a quick, calculated step forward, baiting the general into a strike. As the general swung his blade down, Kale ducked low and rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the blast of energy. The floor beneath him cracked and shattered as the blade cleaved into it. In that split second, Kale saw it, the opening he'd been waiting for. The general's right side, the arm holding the massive blade, was exposed. If he could just get a clean shot. "Now, Rook," Kale yelled. Rook didn't hesitate. With a roar, he fired his heavy pulse rifle, the round slamming into the side of the Gorthian general's armor. The general staggered back, his armor dented and cracked from the impact. Kale's pulse rifle was already up, firing in rapid succession, each shot aimed at the same spot, the gap in the general's side. The general roared in fury, swinging his energy blade wildly in a desperate attempt to retaliate. But Kale was already closing the distance, moving faster than the general could react. He ducked beneath a wild swing and leaped onto the general's back, gripping the creature's neck with one hand, his other drawing a combat knife from his belt. The Gorthian general thrashed violently, trying to shake Kale off, but Kale held tight. His blade found the seam in the general's helmet, and with a swift twist, he drove the knife into the vulnerable joint. The general let out a deafening screech as the blade pierced his armor, a cascade of sparks erupting from the wound. With one final ferocious heave, Kale wrenched the knife free, and the general collapsed to the ground, his massive frame crumpling under its own weight. Kale stood over the fallen general, chest heaving, his weapon raised in case of any last-minute surprises. But there was only silence. The battle had paused, just for a moment. "That's one down," Kale said grimly, wiping the sweat from his brow as he scanned the room. "The Lyra, is the shard ready?" He called again, his voice urgent. "We're almost there," Elira responded. There was a strain in her voice. "But you need to get to the core. I can't stabilize it much longer." Kale didn't waste another second. He sprinted toward the center of the room, where the Chronos shard sat, its eerie glow pulsing brighter than ever. The weight of what was at stake pressed on him like a vice. If they didn't destroy the shard now, the entire galaxy would be in the hands of the Gorthians. The future of entire civilizations rested on their success. Rook, Zora, and Laya were already moving to cover the remaining Gorthian soldiers, who were regrouping in the distance. The team had done their part. Now it was Kal's turn to finish what they started. He approached the shard cautiously, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the exposed core. The room seemed to pulse with energy, as though the shard itself was aware of his presence. Kale had been part of many dangerous missions, but this one felt different. He had no illusions about the power of the Gorthians and the deadly potential of the shard. "Elira, I need you to guide me," Kale said, his voice steady despite the rising tension in the air. "We're running out of time." "Elira." Zora's voice crackled over the comms. There was no response. Kal's stomach twisted with unease. "Elira." He turned around just in time to see her standing motionless, her fingers still hovering over the console, but her eyes wide in shock. She wasn't responding. The Chronos shard's glow was growing more erratic, flashing in a rhythmic pattern that seemed to echo through the room. And then the lights flickered. A new voice, a dark, mechanical voice, sounded over the comms. "You are too late, humans. The shard will not be destroyed. It will be mine." Cal's blood ran cold. The battle was far from over. The voice that reverberated through the comms sent a chill down Cal's spine. It wasn't a Gorthian voice, nor one he had ever heard before. It was colder, more sinister, like the growl of a machine from deep within a forgotten abyss. "You are too late, humans," the voice repeated. "The shard will not be destroyed. It will be mine. I am the architect, and your rebellion ends now." Cal's mind raced. The shard's light pulsed erratically, casting long, shifting shadows across the chamber. Something was wrong. Elira's hands were still suspended over the control console, but her eyes were distant, unblinking, as if trapped in some unseen force. "Elira." Cal's voice was sharp, commanding. He took a step forward, his pulse quickening, but Elira didn't respond. Instead, the shard's glow intensified, casting an unnatural light across the room. It flickered in time with the architect's voice, as if the very energy of the shard was attuned to this malevolent presence. Laya's voice cut through the silence, tense and worried. "Cal, this isn't just a defense grid malfunction. This is something else." Rook stepped forward, his massive frame silhouetted against the glow of the shard. "If the shard is trying to reach out to something, it's not good. We need to shut it down now, before it unleashes whatever's inside." Cal turned toward Rook, his gaze intense. "Can you get a clear shot of the core's main interface? We might have a chance to disrupt it." "I'll do what I can," Rook grunted, his fingers already moving over the weapon controls. "But this doesn't feel like a standard shutdown." As Rook prepared to fire, the room shuddered. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, as if the very structure of the facility was reacting to the shard's awakening. Elira's hands twitched suddenly, and then she stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror. "It's alive," she gasped, her voice strained and weak. "The shard, it's alive." Before Cal could reach her, the architect's voice boomed again, deeper this time, resonating in his bones. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The shard is the key to the Great Awakening. Your world is nothing, insignificant. But with the shard, I shall reshape all of existence. Humanity's reign ends here." Cal's heart raced, his thoughts spinning. The shard wasn't just a weapon. It was a conduit, a gateway. And the architect was no mere invader. Whoever, or whatever, this architect was, it had been manipulating the shard for far longer than they could imagine. "We need to shut it down," Cal shouted, urgency sharpening his voice. His eyes were locked on the pulsing core of the shard, its energy flowing outward like tendrils of darkness. "Elira, can you?" But Elira was no longer in control. Her hands trembled, and her eyes were glazed over. The shard was calling to her, drawing her in. And from the way her body swayed, it was clear that it was more than a mere artifact. It was alive, and it had found its vessel. "Elira," Cal called, but his voice barely reached her. The room seemed to distort around them as the shard's glow grew brighter, and the presence of the architect loomed over everything. The air crackled with an energy Cal had never felt before, an unnatural, oppressive power that made the very air feel thick and heavy. He gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white with the effort. The team was on the brink of losing everything. "Cal," Laya's voice was barely a whisper, "the architect is controlling the shard. Elira's being used as a conduit. She's the key." "What are you suggesting?" Cal's eyes darted between Elira and the unstable core. They were running out of time. "We can't just destroy the shard," Laya said, her voice grim. "If we do, it might take Elira with it. We have to sever the connection somehow." Cal turned back to the core, thinking fast. The only way to sever the link between Elira and the shard was to find the architect's source, the heart of this twisted awakening. But where? How? Suddenly, the architect's voice returned, now all-encompassing, filling the room, the very walls, the ground beneath their feet. The time for resistance has passed. Your world will be crushed beneath the weight of destiny, the voice said, a low, resonant tone like the groaning of a dying star. You will bow before me. I will remake the universe in my image. A tremor ran through the facility as if the very fabric of space was shifting. Kel could feel it. This was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the fate of the galaxy. If they failed, the architect would have control over everything, and no one would be left to stop it. Kel's mind snapped into focus, ignoring the overwhelming pressure around him. The shard wasn't just a weapon. It was a doorway, one that could lead to destruction, but also to salvation. He didn't have the luxury of hesitation. Elira. Kel whispered urgently, his voice soft yet steady. We can end this. You're stronger than it. You can fight back. But Elira's eyes were wide, distant, and filled with fear. The shard had her, and the architect was closing in, his presence suffocating everything. Please, Kel murmured, stepping closer, determined to break the hold. Fight it. Fight for everything we've worked for. The shard's pulse flared in response, its energy surging. Elira's body convulsed, and her hands shot out, gripping the console with a strength that wasn't her own. Kel's breath caught in his throat. Time was running out. They were on the precipice of the unknown. Kel's eyes locked onto Elira as her body convulsed with energy. The shard was pulling at her, its power consuming her from the inside out. The architect's presence seemed to grow stronger with every passing second, pushing back against the resistance of Kel's team. Elira. Kel shouted, his voice raw with desperation. Fight it. You're not alone. We're right here. Her eyes flickered, briefly focusing on him. I can't. It's too powerful. Her voice was weak, trembling, but it was her. The real Elira, buried beneath the weight of the shard's influence. Kel's heart raced. He couldn't let the shard consume her. He wouldn't. Elira, remember who you are. Kel's words were a lifeline, a tether to her humanity. You're the one who cracked the Gorthian encryption. You found the secret codes. You helped us stop their fleets. You are not just some vessel for this thing. You are Earth's brightest mind, and you're stronger than this. Elira's eyes twitched. The shard flickered again, pulsing violently as if reacting to Kel's words. The architect's voice boomed again, full of contempt and mocking amusement. You cannot break the connection. It said, its tone like a dark symphony. This power belongs to me. The shard is mine. Kel stepped forward, his rifle lowered, and with an almost serene calmness, he reached out to Elira. His hand hovered over her shoulder, as if offering warmth, a lifeline in the chaos. Elira, you have to trust us. We're not giving up on you. You've always fought for others. Now, let us fight for you. A moment of silence passed, the only sound the throbbing hum of the shard's energy reverberating through the room. Elira's body jerked again, but her hands, still gripping the console, began to shake more violently. Her breath was labored, but there was something new in her eyes now, a flicker of defiance. I won't. Elira gasped, her voice struggling against the overwhelming power of the shard. I won't let it win. In that instant, Kel's heart surged with hope. She was fighting back. The shard wasn't fully in control. She was still there, still fighting for herself and for everyone who depended on her. Elira, Kel whispered, more to himself than anyone else, you can do this. The shard's glow flared brighter, almost blinding, but Kel didn't look away. He couldn't. His trust in her was unwavering, as it always had been. Suddenly, the lights in the facility flickered and buzzed. The walls groaned in protest as the shard began to pulsate uncontrollably. A violent energy wave erupted from the core, knocking Kale and the others off their feet. Rook's massive frame hit the floor with a thud, but he quickly scrambled to his feet, eyes wide in alarm. "We don't have much time," Rook yelled, his voice strained from the surge of energy. "The shard's destabilizing." Kale turned back to Elira, his thoughts focused entirely on her. "Elira, you need to break the shard's hold. Focus. Use everything you know, everything you are, and shut it down." Her hands, which had once been trembling with agony, now gripped the console with renewed strength. She clenched her jaw, her eyes closed in concentration, and for the first time, Kale saw the full weight of her determination. She wasn't just fighting the shard. She was fighting for all the lives at stake, fighting for humanity's future. "Just a little more," Kale murmured under his breath, his hands clenched into fists. The shard's pulse reached a fever pitch, and then silence. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if the entire facility was suspended in time. And then, with an almost imperceptible hum, the shard's energy began to dissipate. The glow that had once consumed the room faded to a soft, dim light. Elira's eyes fluttered open, and she gasped, taking in deep, ragged breaths. Kale rushed to her side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Elira, you did it." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion, but also with relief. I did." The voice of the architect was no longer present. The oppressive weight that had filled the room seemed to lift, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. The facility was no longer trembling from the shard's power. The battle was over. But Kale knew that this victory was bittersweet. They had won this fight, but the war was far from over. The architect's presence was still a looming threat. The Gorthians were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until humanity was crushed under their heel. "Is the core fully deactivated?" Kale asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Elira nodded weakly. "It's done. The shard's no longer a threat." Kale turned to Rook, Leah, and Zora, who were slowly rising to their feet, eyes scanning the room with vigilance. "We need to move fast. The Gorthian Empire won't give up on this. We've delayed them, but we can't let our guard down." Leah, though exhausted, nodded. "The war isn't over, but we've made a real dent in their plans today. They won't forget this." Kale looked back at the deactivated shard. He could feel its dark energy still lingering in the air, but it was no longer a threat. For now, Earth's people had a chance. They had stopped the architect and saved the galaxy from annihilation, but the road ahead was long. "We've won today," Kale said, his voice resolute. "But the fight for the future of the galaxy is just beginning."